My name's Sally Brinkman. I'm a professor at the University of South Australia, soon to be University of Adelaide. Adelaide University, two universities merging. But I am here because I am the principal investigator for Thrive Kiribati. So we are speaking later. My job at the moment is to introduce Mark, who's the plenary. I'll just read out his bio. So Mark is a clinical psychologist and his training by training and is currently the co-director of the Institute for Life Course Health Research in the Department of Global Health at Stellenbosch University. He is also Professor of Maternal and Child Health in the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Queen's University, Belfast, UK. His scholarly work has involved a diverse range of topics such as improving ECD, mental health, adolescent health, and on life course approaches to understanding child and adolescent development. He's been a consultant for WHO, USAID, UNICEF, World Bank, and many others. He was also one of the coordinating writers of WHO's Nurturing Care for ECD. He has been elected as a member of the Academy of Science in South Africa in 2017. He's published nearly 400 papers. I know many of us will have read many of those, and it's been instrumental in much of all of our work, I am sure. So, welcome to Mark.
Thanks, Sally. First up, just thank you to Susan and the organisers for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. So one of the joys of being as old as I am is when you're invited to give a talk, you can do whatever you want, really. And so I'm not going to talk about the research I've done, but I wasn't sure of the introduction, and so I wanted to say I have done some research. But I'm not going to talk about those results. You know, currently we've got trials happening in Lesotho, in Gambia, in Tanzania, in Kenya. We've done work in Nepal, and so our institute has done a broad range of work in this field. And certainly in the last 15 years, I haven't written a single proposal where I haven't used the word scaling or scale up. And so what I want to do today is problematize that, because I think we need a slightly new way of thinking. I pretty much start every single talk I give now with this quote, and I've changed the quote slightly. So this is Penaloza, who's a previous mayor of Bogota in Colombia, and he was very interested in designing cities for children. So where I've put society, he had cities. So just so that I'm not misquoting him. But that's my frame. That's how I think about things. And at the end of my talk, hopefully I'll come back to that as one of the potential solutions. But we don't do enough of this. So people in this room do, but at a societal level, we definitely don't. Also, just to put my cards on the table here, it is absolutely self-evident that everything everyone does in this room, designing our interventions, trying to spread them, trying to share them, trying to scale them, trying to disseminate them, is absolutely vital and essential. So whatever else I say after this, just remember that's where I stand. Okay, and I try to do that, but that's where I stand. And I worry that I'll also be asking more questions than I have answers for. But again, that's the privilege of age. Can someone move for me? Yeah, thank you. So our current context in the world is not a pretty and a happy one. We're sitting in the context of wars, of massive climate breakdown, and in the context where we don't know what's going to happen with AI. Many people are very scared about what's going to happen with AI. Personally, I'm not scared of AI, but I'm terrified of the people in control of it. So the Musks, and I have to mention him first because he was born in my he was born in my country. The Zuckerbergs and the Altmans. I'm actually very, very scared of the people in control of this technology. So we are living in a context where there's massive uncertainties. We don't know what the future holds. And for children, I think that's quite profound. I worry that we're the first generations. I have 2 adolescent sons. I worry that we're the first generation that is handing our children a world with this level of uncertainty. It's not like things haven't been bad before, but it hasn't felt quite as existential, I don't think, as it does right now for many children and many, many adolescents. So this is a term that UNICEF used a lot following COVID, and I loved it. So I've used this everywhere, right? So it was in 2023. In preparing this talk, I discovered this thing that I hadn't heard of. I'm sure many economists in this room may have heard of this, called the problematique. So if you think about that definition, an interconnected web of near-simultaneous adversities manifesting independently in a globalized world. And the problematique is not word for word, but it's essentially saying the same thing. So 2023, and this is 1970. So from 1970 to 2023, in some ways what we've done is we've simply redefined or given a new name to the very same problem. So I don't know if what we should be doing is calling it a polyproblematique or something. Maybe that's for 20 years' time. But this makes me quite sad. This makes me melancholic, that in a sense we're saying the same things 50 years or more later. Even more worryingly is the Club of Rome was an attempt to try to understand in 1969, 1970, what was going to happen in terms of climate in the world. So Dennis Meadows, Donella Meadows were asked, 2 American researchers, to run some models predicting the future. Now you can imagine what running a model on a computer in 1969-70 was like. So they worked for a year, and they came up with basically the startling realization that the world was in real trouble because of climate breakdown. This is 1970. And wrote a book called The Limits to Growth. And as tends to happen, that was really one of the starts, was then the corporations quietly lobbied against it and squashed it, those findings. They were, we know about the disinformation. And so what potentially could have been utterly transformative in changing the world in terms of how we understand climate breakdown. And it's not like they were the first. Rachel Carson was talking about this in Silent Spring a long time before that. So we have this tendency to repeat the same mistakes and to not, I don't think, particularly learn from what we already know. And then I found this lovely quote from David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist, American neuroscientist. And anyone who hasn't, he's got some wonderful books. He's at Stanford and does some amazing work, I think. And this is a quote actually from a podcast that he runs. And he says, "We appear unable to think of complex systems. We cannot hold the level of complexity in our heads, and so we become storytellers. We turn a vast social tapestry into a single silhouette." And I think that's fine. I do. I really believe that's fine. If we can't hold the complexity, we have to tell a story. And I want to just argue here that some of the stories we're telling may be doing us a little bit of a disservice. So I don't mean this to be judgmental. I do this. We all tell stories. It's fine. But those stories and those frames and those paradigms, I believe, are absolutely vital. So, for example, one of them is I have a real, it's like, I don't know, like a hobby horse, a real issue with how we use the term ECD. Now, Susan will have heard me talk about this a lot. And I've given up fighting this. I've lost this battle. But you cannot scale ECD. You can't. You can scale an ECD, a program to improve ECD. You can scale, but try to scale an intervention to improve ECD. You cannot scale ECD because ECD is an outcome. All of us in the room are trying to improve early child development. That's what we're trying to do. So you can't scale that. In my country, our Department of Social Development talk about we fund ECDs. So for them, it's a place. It's a preschool. And that language seems potentially not that important, but it's absolutely vital, because when you do that, and my friend and colleague Linda Richter is always talking about this, early means early. And if you say we fund ECDs and therefore we're doing ECD, well, then you start at about 4 or 3. and everything before that gets forgotten about. So these have real consequences, the language we use, the frames and the paradigms. So here's from Dilemma Meadows, from that Club of Rome, from her book, Limits to Growth. And anybody who hasn't seen the work of Dilemma Meadows, it's amazing. She wrote, I think, probably the core book on systems theory and systems work and how to think about systems. So I'm not going to read that out, but I'm going to let you read them. And these are the frames, the paradigms we have in our head that are there and we don't think about them. They're unconscious, and they guide, though, they have incredible pressure, incredible influence in guiding how and what we think. These paradigms, these frames. So here's one of them. So all of us, again, and I've done this, I've written many papers where I've said we're trying to improve early child development in order to improve human capital formation. So a lot of us talk about human capital. I'm going to contend that it was a very good marketing tool, a very good advocacy tool, but we should stop doing that for any number of reasons. Firstly, children then are always becoming. They're not valuable in and of themselves. They're only valuable because they will become a producer in 20 years' time. They'll somehow meet their human capital potential. It also, if you're a child with a disability, what does that say to you? Where you may not be able to contribute economically or contribute to human capital. So I think we need to shift it to the moral imperative of now. That we do things now for children because it's the right thing to do, whoever they are, and whether or not they become consumers or producers later on in life. And I can fully see the value of this argument, but I would contend that enough is enough. We need to think of different terms. So let's talk about scaling up. So I'm not going to speak too much about this. So I'm coming from the point of view, and maybe I should say this right at the beginning. What I want to do is I want to see population level change. I want to see countries shift, okay? And of course, there's lots of different types of scaling up. I mean, I can do an intervention in a primary healthcare clinic in one hospital in London, and I can find good evidence and move it to another hospital. That's scaling, that's spreading, that's sharing. I'm completely okay with that. That's absolutely fine. What I'm interested in is I want the whole system to change. And not just, so these are the words we use: dissemination, knowledge translation, spreading, scale up, scaling. And again, I think we've got mixed up in our terms. So I remember, because I'm old enough, 20 years ago, we weren't talking about scale up. We were talking about knowledge dissemination. That was the big thing we started speaking about. And I think every researcher in this room, that is what we should be doing, no matter what. We have to find ways to talk about what we do, and we have to tell other people about it. We have to tell people, members of the public, communities, stakeholders. We have to tell them about it in a way they understand and a way that's meaningful, no question. But somehow, I think over the last 20 years, that's become morphed into scale up. And here's another contention, and I'm very happy to be fought with and argued with and berated after this, is that, I want to be careful here, I would suggest that 95% of scientists, researchers, developing interventions, thinking about them, know absolutely nothing about scaling, and never will. And I start with me. I was never taught about scaling. I never went to university. What do I know about scaling? People who know about scaling are people who work in the Ministry of Health. That's who knows about scaling, not researchers. We can help the people who know about scaling measure it and evaluate it and monitor it, but we don't know about scaling, and we have to stop kidding ourselves that we know about scaling. It's a wonderful aim and goal, but we're not experts on that, and we have to find those experts and work with them much more than we are. And that morphing, I think, has been a slow thing, and I think we need to do it slightly differently. So this is I've used this before, and I just love this story. So I'm going to read it out. So there's a man in a hot air balloon. He looks down, and he sees a man walking in the field below him. He shouts, "Hey, you, where am I?" The person on the ground looks up and answers, "You're in a hot air balloon suspended vertically about 200 feet above the ground with no visible means of descent." Person in the balloon says, "You must be a researcher." So he says, "Yeah, well, how do you know?" So he says, "Well, you're full of technically correct information that is totally irrelevant to my current situation." Person says, "You must be a policymaker." Yes, how did you know?" "Well, you don't know where you are, you don't know what to ask to find out what you need, and you're blaming other people for your current situation." So these are two studies. One, many of you will know about, the Spring study. And this was a big study in improving early child development in Pakistan and India. And the attempt was to integrate these services into the existing health system with existing cadres of workers at scale. The other is a study where the main outcome paper is still to come out. It's a study I was involved in, funded by the Hilton Foundation many years ago in Siaya County in Kenya. These were the two sort of almost like sort of the poster child studies of what we were going to be able to show of how to integrate into a health system at scale. And both of them didn't work. Okay, both of them didn't work, which as a researcher, as a scientist, I think's very, very important. And as we know, most studies that aren't successful don't even get published. So I think it's really important that they published. But it just shows some of the complexities of what it takes. And I would argue that what we're doing a lot of the time, and remember what I said at the beginning, it's self-evident that what we do in developing interventions and programs is vital. But we then imagine that these micro solutions are going to solve macro problems. And they can't. They can't solve macro problems. I did a sort of a landscaping review for Grand Challenges Canada and EGDAN last year. And one of my respondents, researchers, spoke about the petri dish of the RCT. And of course, it's absolutely vital. It's the gold standard. It's some of the best evidence we're going to get on any intervention. But it is a petri dish. It's not the real world. And I think we've often forgotten that. And a number of years ago, with people at WHO, we did interviews with a number of stakeholders globally. And this is one of the quotes that really stood out to me. And this I found quite difficult to hear in a way, because at this point, that's all I'd done was interventions and packages. So this was them saying to me that that's all very well, but that's not how things work in the real world. And it's only one part of an enormous jigsaw. And I bet you if I sat with any one of you with drinking coffee after this, all of you would acknowledge this. We would know this. We know that our intervention is not going to solve the world's problems. But I do think there's something's got lost in the ether around scaling and what we can actually do, that we just need a small little readjustment. And then another one, an economist I spoke to said about interventions and packages, it's a bit like putting flour in an oven and then expecting a cake in an hour's time. And I love that. I love that quote, even more so because it came from an economist. So again, we develop our RCTs. We say they've got causal, explanatory power, and therefore, if you do this intervention, this will be the solution. But in fact, that's the real world out there. Outside of that laboratory, outside of our petri dishes, that's the real world. And I don't think we've come close to engaging with that. So this is a paper many of you will have heard about, because it was very controversial in 2023 when it came out. So Megan Stevens was in the Boston Law Review, and she was looking at the criminal justice system in the US, and she looked at 50 years of RCTs. And the criminal justice system in the US and all the interventions around recidivism, problem solving, cash transfer, all that, an enormous amount of work has been done. And what she did, she looked at it and she put a little bit of a stringent, it was less a systematic review than putting stringent criteria. Like she said, if a study didn't have a certain sample size, it was out. If If the person that developed the study, the original RCT, also did the other RCTs to show it was working, that was considered to be problematic. Because again, it's too much investment, not enough of the real world. And her conclusion was, at the end, that there's been no impact at all in 50 years. And also part of this is long-term impact. Not just can you show an impact of your intervention immediately after or 12 months after, but can you show it long-term? And her evidence was that, no, you can't. And she uses these two analogies, and she introduces the notion of stabilizers. And she said all of us, and I think this is true certainly for me, and I imagine for lots of people here, we have this belief that if we do, like that early intervention, for example, is an inoculation. It's like a vaccine. Or that what it does is it's like there'll be a cascade effect. If you change this, there'll be a cascade onto that and a cascade onto that. And she speaks explicitly to this issue in the paper. And she says it doesn't work like that, because what it is it's like an orange in a bowl. And what we do with our intervention is we pull the orange up to the side, and oh wow, it's about to get out, everything's cool, and it rolls back in. Goes back to where it was. The stabilizers in people's environments, in their context, the socioeconomic characteristics of where they are, pull them back to that. And she says that's probably not even the best example, and she uses the example of a piece of wood in the sea. And she says what our interventions are like, it's in a strong current, it's being pulled out from the coast, it's now in a current. And what our interventions are a lot of the time, and I think this is important again for me to say, even if it's just for my benefit, these interventions are important. It's like a bit of a wind, and it blows that piece of wood a little bit. But if other things don't happen, the current will take it back, and it'll go back in where it was. Now, I don't mean this to sound like catastrophic or anything, or like a nihilism about this, because if you don't have the wind, you haven't got anything. We have to do that. But we do have to be much more cautious about what we imagine our interventions are going to achieve. And this is a direct quote from her paper. And I'm just really putting it there because it provoked me, and I'm hoping it provokes you a little bit. But the social sciences' holy grail, the small, inexpensive intervention with large, widespread, and lasting gains, appears to be mostly a myth. So having now depressed you, what do we do? So again, I think paradigms and stories are utterly vital. So one is a quote from one of my mentors, who used to say this to me routinely when we were trying to do interventions, and some of those absolutely didn't work. And she would always say, people change slowly, in relationships, in little steps, with lots of practice, with opportunities for reward, kind of an incentive, and that doesn't have to be money, it can be lots of incentives, and across time. And if we think there's a magic bullet that's going to, at any point, take one of those away, we're mistaken. It can't. And so our interventions, again, are an absolutely crucial, vital part of that puzzle. But we've got to start thinking about all these other stabilizers and stop pretending that these cascades. And again, remember I said I'm not talking about small scaling. I'm talking about population change, which by definition assumes you want system change, complex system change. And the idea that we can impose our will on a system with a gold standard Petri dish RCT result, I think is mistaken. What it involves, I do a lot of work with the Hilton Foundation. And the Hilton Foundation works in a number of countries in Africa. And a lot of the work in Kenya, for example, has been, a lot of it's about interventions, there's some RCTs, but a big portion of it for over 10 years has been working with ministries in the health system, building that level of trust, building all the things without any immediate outcome, not any measurable outcome, but just staying the course and being with people in those ministries, trying to understand the system, not just the system in Nairobi, but the system in Kisumu, because they actually differ quite a lot. And if you go to the coast, it differs even more. So how do you understand all these in a very, very deep way? And stop pretending that our will be sufficient. And even if we publish in the Lancet, that will's not enough. It's not good enough. I also think, and this goes back to my point about, are we the experts in this? And I don't think researchers are experts in scale. What we need I think there's a chasm, and we used to call it the knowledge, as I said, the knowledge translation chasm. But in fact, the chasm's quite profound between data and policy and complex and system change. It's enormous. And I think we need more, and this wasn't my term, someone spoke about bridges. I forget where I got it from. And people who have worked as a researcher doing RCTs for 20 years and someone who's been working in the health ministry for 15 years. And they intimately know both of those, and they can act as the bridge between those. And we can, as a scientist, produce the good evidence to give to them, to allow them to take it and see how it evolves, and then pull us back in, as I said, to evaluate, to monitor, and help with that. But we're not the experts. We need more of these bridges. This is a business person, Collins, who had these sort of ideas around, and this is about scale up in the business world. And I just like some of the terms that he uses. So without leadership, very little happens. Leadership, wherever it is, leadership on a study, leadership in a system, leadership at a national government is all key. Those people, the leaders, often, certainly in my experience of NGOs and CBOs and that, you often have these incredibly charismatic people who are very good at making money, raising money for funding. But in fact, it's often the less charismatic ones, the more consistent, the solid leadership across time, who sticks it out, who's prepared to take hits of non-success. That is key. As I said, early intervention is not an inoculation. There's stabilizers all along the life course. We have 2 long-term cohorts, both recruited in pregnancy, both received an intervention, one followed up at 17 years, one currently, or until Trump came in, it was NIMH, we were following up a cohort. And in all of those, we had amazing early results, immediately post, and even up to 12 months, even up to 3 years. By the time we got to 8 years, kind of going, 12 years, everything's gone. Because the context in which these children live are extreme, and all these stabilizers are pulling them back again. And if we don't find ways of how to target, how to give certain interventions to certain people, that sometimes we're not going to achieve what we want. In my context, recruitment, training, management, accountability are all key. And we all know what happens with our RCTs, which we have all of those things. We then take it into a system, and because of cost cutting, because of fiscal constraints, what happens? Well, we'll reduce the training, we'll stop supervision, and we won't have necessarily the best manager. And then we imagine we're still going to see the same results. It's illusory. It's not going to happen because those are fundamental. And we have to understand the system in all its messiness. Even if we're not really able to hold it all in our minds, and again, that's why we need more of these bridges of people who can do this. And I'm going to move on because I know I'm running out of time. So I think the children are in an emergency right now. Whether it's climate breakdown, I think we live in a context where, at very best, there's no global leadership. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that it's regressive. And I don't need to tell anyone in this audience about what's happened this year. So that's the context we're in. And this is the context where children are. And so when Jonathan Haidt tells me that the American teen mental health crisis is solely about the fact that Facebook and other social media kind of hit in 2012, I'm sure he's right that that's part of the story. But guess what also happened there was political polarization, real awareness of climate breakdown. I think young people and adolescents are in distress, and we are in an emergency, and we need to do something quite different. And so to end off, just a couple of things that I think we could do. And this follows my favorite anarchist, David Graeber. And I would argue that we need to be thinking in entirely different paradigms. So for example, and I know this I won't see in my lifetime, but I fundamentally believe that all children should be able to vote from the age of 12. Not 16, but 12. If we did that, I suspect everything would change. Because politicians would have to take 12 to 18-year-old children seriously. They'd have to learn to talk with them. They're not going to let it happen because 14-year-olds know a lot of stuff and haven't got sort of stuck in a rut about who they vote for. They'll listen to what politicians are offering or promising, and they will take action on that basis. So that's an argument that I think would change the debate, massively, and I think we should implement. Another thing is that I think the children should be at the basis, and this goes back to Penalosa's quote, is that children should be at the center of every single decision we make in government. And I mean every single one. Where to build a road, in this country, in Europe, quite a big thing, whether 5% of the budget should go to fund defense and war, as opposed to 1% or 0.5%. And if children were at the center, very different decisions, I think, would actually be made. The road would take into account, in most parts of the world, children's safety more than it does right now. So my argument would be, if we put children at the center, we have an opportunity not to fix things, but to tell a slightly different story that may allow us to see other possibilities that our current paradigms right now, I'm not sure do. So I'll stop there. Thank you.